1 MDB. Najib Razak. The largest kleptocracy case the Department of Justice has ever prosecuted. You've been told corruption is a moral failure. The historical record says something more structural is operating. You watch a sovereign wealth fund get created to fund development. You watch billions disappear within years. You watch a prime minister's bank account receive $681 million and call it a donation. You notice the explanation keeps changing. The official story describes a scandal. The mechanism sits elsewhere. This is a story about state capture. What happens when the institutions meant to constrain power become the tools that enable theft instead? In 2009, Najib Razak became Prime Minister of Malaysia. Within months, he created One Malaysia Development Berhad, a sovereign wealth fund meant to drive strategic investment and economic development. He chaired its advisory board personally. The deeper question is not whether one MDB stole money. The deeper question is why a structure that concentrated, rather than distributed, oversight was allowed to exist at all. Financial history gives this phenomenon a name: resource curse dynamics, typically applied to oil states, but equally applicable to sovereign capital. When a state controls a large, discretionary pool of capital with weak institutional checks, the capital becomes a target for the people closest to it, not external actors, but the very officials meant to deploy it productively. Daniel Kaufman and the World Bank Institute's governance research throughout the 2000s established a consistent finding. State capture correlates more strongly with concentrated decision-making power than with the absolute wealth of a nation. Malaysia wasn't poor. It wasn't lacking in financial sophistication. What it lacked was separation between the people allocating capital and the people who would benefit from its diversion. This is where the historical record becomes useful. In 1992, Mobutu Seko Zaire offered a precedent. Mobutu treated the central bank as a personal account, with researchers later estimating he diverted billions over his rule. The mechanism was identical in structure if not in scale: a head of state with discretionary access to state capital, operating through entities with minimal external audit. The outcome was the same: capital flight into real estate, art, and offshore accounts, while domestic infrastructure stagnated. You've been told one MDB was uniquely Malaysian. The pattern says otherwise. It's a recurring structural failure mode whenever sovereign capital lacks an enforced separation between custodian and beneficiary. But the more important mechanism is this: one MDB didn't simply get stolen in one transaction. It moved through layers, joint ventures, fake advisory fees, shell companies, designed specifically to exploit gaps in cross-border financial oversight. According to the United States Department of Justice's 2016 civil forfeiture complaint, more than $4.5 billion was misappropriated from one MDB between 2009 and 2014, moved through a network of shell companies and bank accounts across the United States, Switzerland, Singapore, and Luxembourg. The Dodge complaint named Low Teak JHO, known publicly as JHO Low, as the central figure orchestrating fund flows, alongside Malaysian and Saudi officials. This is the Cantillon Effect, operating at sovereign scale. Richard Cantillon, the 18th century economist, observed that those closest to the source of new money capture disproportionate benefit before the effects diffuse outward. In one MDB's case, the people closest to the fund's capital inflows, its advisors, its intermediaries, its chairman, captured value before a single development project broke ground. You see press releases describing strategic energy partnerships. You see joint ventures with Saudi-linked entities. You see complex financing arrangements involving bond issuances arranged by Goldman Sachs. You don't see the underlying cash actually reaching productive investment. The deeper question is why so much capital can move through legitimate financial institutions without triggering intervention. Here is what that pattern historically produced: regulatory arbitrage. 1MDB's bond issuances, arranged through Goldman Sachs between 2012 and 2013, raised approximately $6.5 billion. Goldman Sachs earned roughly $600 million in fees and commissions, a figure many specialists at the time considered unusually high relative to comparable sovereign bond issuances. The U.S. Department of Justice and Malaysian authorities later alleged that a portion of the bond proceeds were diverted, and Goldman Sachs itself pleaded guilty in 2020 to violating the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, agreeing to pay penalties exceeding $2.9 billion globally in connection with the case. You watch one of the most scrutinized financial institutions in the world facilitate transactions tied to alleged fraud. You realize compliance frameworks are not designed to catch every form of misconduct. They're designed to catch specific, predictable categories of risk. Sophisticated actors structure transactions around the edges of what gets flagged. This is moral hazard in its purest institutional form. The banker who structures the deal isn't the one who bears the reputational or legal cost if the underlying fund turns out to be compromised, at least not initially. Charles Kindleberger's Manias, Panics, and Crashes, 1978, documented this dynamic across centuries of financial history. Intermediaries who profit from transaction volume have weaker incentives to scrutinize transaction quality than the principals who bear ultimate risk. Who benefits in this structure? The arrangers, who earn fees regardless of outcome. Who absorbs the risk? The fund itself, and ultimately Malaysian taxpayers. Who gains optionality? Officials positioned to redirect capital flows before oversight catches up. Who carries the cost? Citizens whose development fund became a development liability. You watch $681 million land in Najib Razak's personal bank accounts in 2013. You watch his administration initially deny any wrongdoing. You watch the explanation evolve: first total denial, then acknowledgement of a deposit, then characterization of the funds as a personal donation from the Saudi royal family. The official explanation describes the transaction. The mechanism sits in what made the transaction possible: a sovereign fund chairman with sufficient discretionary authority that personal and state capital became functionally indistinguishable. Ray Dalio's Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises, 2018, focused primarily on debt cycles, but its underlying thesis applies here. Systems built on trust in institutional integrity are only as strong as their weakest enforcement point. Malaysia's institutional weak point wasn't a lack of laws against corruption. Malaysia had anti-corruption statutes. The weak point was prosecutorial independence. The Attorney General, who initially cleared Najib of wrongdoing in 2016, was replaced shortly after, and it was only after a change in government in 2018 that prosecution began in earnest. You see laws on the books. You see enforcement contingent on political alignment. You notice the legal framework matters less than who controls its application. This is the deeper pattern beneath 1MDB, and beneath kleptocracy cases more broadly. The rule of law functions as a constraint only when enforcement is structurally separated from the people it might constrain. When the same political apparatus controls both the rule-making and rule-enforcing functions, legal frameworks become theatrical rather than operative. Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson's research on extractive versus inclusive institutions, most widely summarized in their 2012 work, established a recurring finding across dozens of national case studies. Extractive institutions concentrate both economic and political power in the same hands, producing short-term capital extraction at the cost of long-term institutional credibility. Malaysia's sovereign credit rating, investor confidence, and currency stability all weakened in the years following the scandal's emergence, a structural cost that persisted long after any individual transaction was reversed. You watch the ringgit weaken through 2015. You watch foreign direct investment hesitate. You watch a country's financial credibility, built over decades, erode through actions concentrated in a handful of years. What looked like an isolated corruption scandal is actually a recognizable pattern, a leverage cycle of political trust. Political capital, like financial capital, can be borrowed against. Najib's administration borrowed against the public's trust in state institutions, using a development narrative to access discretionary capital. When the underlying misallocation surfaced, the cost wasn't paid only in financial terms. It was paid in a depreciation of institutional credibility that took years to partially rebuild. The 2018 Malaysian general election removed Najib's coalition from power for the first time in the nation's history as an independent state. Mahathir Mohamad's incoming government reopened 1MDB investigations. In 2020, a Malaysian court convicted Najib Razak on 7 charges related to a related entity, SRC International, sentencing him to 12 years in prison, later reduced through a pardon process that has itself generated significant public controversy in Malaysia. You see a prime minister convicted. You see global financial institutions fined. You see a fund's discretionary structure dismantled. You don't see the structural conditions that enabled it fully eliminated. Sovereign wealth funds in other jurisdictions still operate with limited independent oversight, still concentrate discretionary authority, still rely on the integrity of individuals rather than the architecture of institutions. This is where the historical record becomes useful again. Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff's this time is different. 2009 examined centuries of financial crises and found a consistent psychological pattern. Each generation assumes its institutions are too sophisticated, too transparent, too modern to repeat historical failures. The 1MDB case demonstrates this assumption was wrong even in a financially sophisticated, internationally connected economy with access to elite global banking relationships. You notice Malaysia wasn't an isolated, poorly governed state. It had functioning capital markets, international banking relationships, and a credit rating that attracted global investors. The scandal didn't happen because the system was unsophisticated. It happened because sophistication and integrity are different properties, and financial markets routinely conflate them. Who gains political flexibility in systems like this? Leaders who can point to development narratives while quietly directing discretionary capital toward personal and patronage networks. Who gains time? Officials who exploit the lag between transaction execution and forensic discovery. In 1MDB's case, years passed before the full scope of fund diversion became public. Who carries the cost over the long run? Citizens, through diminished public investment, weakened currency stability, and reduced international financial trust that takes years to rebuild. The reframe that matters here isn't about Malaysia specifically. It's about the conditions any sovereign capital pool creates when discretionary authority and independent oversight are not structurally separated. The same vulnerability exists, in varying degrees, in sovereign wealth funds, state pension systems, and large infrastructure funds, anywhere the chain of accountability runs through a small number of individuals with both authority and access. You won't just watch the next sovereign wealth fund headline as a story about a country's economic strategy. You'll be watching for the structural question underneath it. Who has both the authority to direct this capital and the ability to operate without independent verification? Where those two conditions overlap, the historical record suggests the outcome is not a question of if, but when. The next time you hear about a state-backed investment fund, a sovereign bond issuance, or a development initiative funded by public capital, you won't just be watching the stated mission. You'll be watching the structure of oversight beneath it. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.